Hey everyone. Hey everyone. Just going live on YouTube now. All right, it looks like we're live on YouTube. We're talking about natural Emu-Nity versus the juice. You know what I'm talking about? All right, so if you're on YouTube, you're gonna get the screen share. If you're on Instagram or you're on Facebook, uh you might want to just follow along by going to chrismasterjohnphd.com/e hyphen moo hyphen nitty or just go to the link in my profile or the link I just distributed on all my social media profiles, which has it has the article that I just wrote by popular demand. So everyone voted this morning, and I should have just done I should have just done what was going to be easiest, but instead I let people vote, and they all voted for the thing that would be the hardest. Which, just because I've been working on Delta and transmission this whole week, and so I'm very immersed in where I am on that. But by popular demand across the voting on all social media channels, everyone wanted to, disproportionately know about natural Emu-Nity versus the juice. All right, so y'all know that probably Instagram's going to deplatform me first, and so I'm seeing if I can hack the code around that. And so I'm doing screen share on YouTube, where YouTube seems pretty safe in terms of what you're allowed to show on the screen, whereas it's very clear that Instagram is just scanning the pictures for the words they don't want you to use and racking points against you to start, people can't like my not everyone, right? So what they do it in a way where they're gaslighting you, so that a certain small percentage of people, they try to hit the like button, and the heart just, it goes on, it goes off, goes on, it goes off. But then that they're letting people like my pictures because I'll put out something and it'll get 2,000 likes. Obviously people can like it. So it's just they're reducing the number of likes by taking a segment of people who try to like it, and they're like, why did 1,000 other people like it but I can't like it? And then they send me a message on Instagram, they're like, I'm trying to like it but I can't. And then there's the people who can't mention me. I don't know if no one can mention me on Instagram, or if it's only some people can't mention me on Instagram. I get tagged and stuff, so some people can mention me. But just randomly people can't mention me. So all these are hints that Instagram is looking for an excuse to get me the heck off of it. So we are talking about emu, like the cow, nitty, natural nitty, figure it out, and the juice. You know what that means. All right. You can look at the picture. It's got the juice and it's got the parentheses. You know what it means. By the way, look at the picture that I put on Instagram today. Look at it tonight. It's got no warning. It's got no warning. You know what it's about. It's got no warning. Anyway, this shirt is from Max Public House, freedomoverfearusa.com. Max Public House. We went down under lock, and Max was like, nah, we're not under lock. And so the sheriff came and busted them up a bit, and they just got over a dozen summons thrown out of court because the judge said it was political. And so this is Max Public House. Anyway, check out Danny Presti on Instagram, Max Public House. And if you like this, shirt, you can go to freedomoverfearusa.com and support Max Public House during all their legal battles and stuff, because they are also suing the city. So if you want to help support the lawsuits, then buy a shirt if you like it. Anyway, we're talking about natural Emu-Nity and the juice. So for people on YouTube, I'm going to share my screen and bring up that article. But again, I shared this on social media, and I shared it across all social media. You can go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/e-moo-nity, or on pretty much all my profiles. If you use my link tree, which is the link in my profile, you can get it. And so one of my dear friends told me the other day that I was cherry picking studies when I said I was cherry picking preprints when I said that natural E-Moo-Nity is clearly much better than the juice. And I said, no, I'm not. Show me one thing that contradicts this. But then y'all asked for the post on E-Moo-Nity this morning. And so I spent, whenever I released that poll, I just finished this article. Like I believe I spent 12 hours on this article today, and I didn't anticipate that, but I wound up realizing that there were a number of studies I didn't know about. And of course, someone sent a link in my Telegram and said, well, actually there's 91 studies on this. Well, no, there's not. There's, there might be 91 studies just looking at different aspects of natural E-Moo-Nity, whether it's antibodies or T cells or what have you. But that's not what this post is about. And especially because, when you're looking at mechanisms, mechanisms can tell you two things. They can help you hypothesize what an effect might be, or if you know of an effect, they can help you explain that effect. But mechanisms don't tell you the effect, right? So you can look at all the antibody studies and all the T cell studies in the world, and they're not going to tell you anything about your infection risk, because we don't have the sensitivity and specificity of the biomarkers for infection risk. And although in the juice trials, they are publishing some results, for example, the modern juice, you know what I mean, the modern juice has as opposed to Mr. Fuzzy juice and Aztec juice, and Mr. Johnson juice, right? You know what I mean by the modern juice. Anyway, so in the modern juice, they have a correlates of immunity study where they come and they put, neutralizing antibodies, just total antibodies, and various things like that. But even there, where we know that it's the correlate of immunity for a juiced person getting infected, we don't know that even for the placebo group in that trial, let alone for people who have natural immunity, right? And so if we don't have those validated as sensitive and specific predictors of infection risk across these populations, we cannot, if 80 of the studies that are on that are just looking at the markers and they're not validated as markers of anything in particular, then we can't use those, right? And I will get to what we can use as tests to prove that you have natural immunity as we talk about this. But generally speaking, just because the antibodies in your blood doesn't tell you what your infection risk is. And so I went through PubMed for the peer-reviewed papers, although PubMed's increasingly publishing. I can't believe how tired I felt before and how awake I feel now that I'm talking. I did feel like this is the end of my research, so I have a glass of wine. Anyway, so I went through PubMed, and I went through SSRN, and I went through medRxiv and bioRxiv. So the three major preprint sites that have papers on this, and PubMed for the peer-reviewed papers. And I collected what I believe is every single study that looks at the risk of infection in unjuiced people with natural immunity and compares that to the infection risk of people who have never been infected but did get juiced. And yes, I do, when possible, look at the combination of those. But the first and most basic criteria if it didn't separate the one type of immunity from the other so that we can compare them head to head from that study, then it didn't qualify. And so there are 9 studies, and this does not include the study from Kentucky that the Centers for You Know What had put out. Which, by the way, MMWR, which is run by the Centers for You Know What, is not a peer-reviewed journal. And so it's so funny that before any of these preprints from Israel were coming out, everyone wanted to look at this paper that was not comparing the juice to natural E-Moo-Nity, because everyone had natural E-Moo-Nity. It was just looking at adding the juice versus not adding the juice. And everyone who was, pro juice was plastering this everywhere. And MMWR is not a peer-reviewed journal. It's reviewed by the CD, the other letter editors to make sure that it corresponds with their policy, comports with their policy, but it's not peer-reviewed for the rigor of the science. And so it's just so funny that preprints come out and then the NPR trolls, the not peer-reviewed trolls, come out of the woodwork and it's not peer-reviewed, it's not peer-reviewed, as if you always know that someone has never published a peer-reviewed paper or peer-reviewed a paper when they think that there's this binary black and white. Peer review means it's legitimate, not peer-reviewed means we can't conclude anything from it. Anyway, all right. So out of these 9 studies, what do we got? Well, I want to say, first of all, that why are we asking this question? All right. Because the type of data we want to look at totally depends on why we're asking the question. So are we asking the question because we want to know a biological effect, like we're an academic? Well, in that case, we want to know the mechanisms. We want everything perfectly controlled so we can say this, not say that. This is the cause and effect going on here, right? But most of us don't care about that. That's the type of thing that I care about. But most of us don't care about that. So what do we care about? Well, there are a few practical questions that we would want to ask. The first one is, if I have been infected, do I need, it's 3 questions. Do I need to get juiced so that my immunity can be as good as everyone else who's juiced around me? That's question number 1. What should I do for me? Question number 2, maybe I'm the same or better in my E-Moo-Nity than everyone else around me, but do I still want the juice to make it even better? Do I want to be super E-Moo-Nity? Do I want to take 27 times and make it 48 times? Okay. Then the third question is, if I'm in charge of firing you, or I'm in charge of telling you that you're not allowed to go to the gym, or I'm in charge of telling you that you're not allowed to go in the restaurant, or you're not allowed to go to the public swimming pool, or your 13-year-old kid is not allowed in after-school activities, does it make any scientific sense for me to not consider E-Moo-Nity, natural E-Moo-Nity, just as good or better than the juice? All right. So these are different things, right? If I want to know what is the biological effect of me having natural E-Moo-Nity, getting juiced on top of it, then I want highly controlled cause and effect data, because I'm talking about what is the effect of this treatment, or what is the effect of this prevention, or whatever you want to call, however you want to characterize it. But on the other hand, if we are talking about a juice mandate, we don't want controlled data. We don't want biological cause and effect. We don't want we don't want to control for the confounding factors. Why? Because the bouncer in front of the restaurant who's checking your juice card is not using a multivariate model to control for your BMI and your age and your, the survivorship bias that was associated with you not having died last year and all these other things. The bouncer is just trying to understand, people are coming up to me in the line. Do I know from this person's card, can I know whether they're immune or not? Right? So we want the completely confounded data when we're trying to understand the scientific rationale of a juice mandate, because the scientific rationale of a juice mandate is just saying, if there's 8 million people in the city and I want to divide them all into juiced and unjuiced, does that tell me who's clean and who's unclean, who's safe and who's dangerous? Okay. So we want well-controlled data where we understand what's going on when we're trying to understand the treatment or prevention effect. I'm going to take this and it's going to do whatever to me, right? Because I know in this instant, I am my own control for all my confounding factors, right? My BMI is my BMI, so I am controlled for BMI. My age is my age, so I am controlled for age, right? So I want to understand, when you control for age and BMI and all these things, what is taking this juice do to me? That's control for confounding factors I want, because I in myself am the control for all of my own confounding factors. When I'm the bouncer, when I'm the governor, or when I'm the mayor, or when I am the dictator and I'm telling you whether you can have a job or not, and I'm telling that to 8 million other people based on whether they, filled out my juice form, I don't want multivariate models. I just want to know, take a random sample of people, juiced, unjuiced. Does that tell me who's clean, who's unclean? Okay, so let's go into these studies. So first of all, there are the two clinical trials. So obviously there was more than 2 types of juice, but there were 2 types of juice where they're clinical trials. And by the way, if you're on my article, all the references are right there. You can just click the link and go straight to it. If you're on YouTube, I'm showing you right now the screen share. I'm showing you right now the screen share where the links are right there, and I'm scrolling through it as you go on. So you can look where in the section where I am, just click the links if you're following along. Okay, so the 2 juice trials that separately reported juiced no E-Moo-Nity, E-Moo-Nity no juice infection risk are the Mr. Fuzzy trial and the Aztec trial. Now, in both of these, we have to consider a few things. So first of all, these are both funded and controlled by the juice manufacturers. That's number one. All right. So they differ from all the other studies that we're going to look at, all other 7, in that they're funded and controlled by the juice manufacturers. So that's number one. Number 2, all of these are pre-Delta. In fact, only 2 of the studies we're going to talk about are Delta, but these are pre-Delta, pre-Alpha. These are like basically pre-variant. I mean, they overlap, but like now when you're looking at studies, they always say, well, during this time period, Alpha was dominant or Delta was dominant. Back in these trials, they don't say that because it was before the time where we were really concerned about what variant was dominant at all. All right. So these are basically pre-variant. And they're certainly pre-Delta. And not only that, but they were not designed to look at the comparison between natural E-Moo-Nity and the juice. They only wanted to show that the juice was effective. And the only reason they even measured who had natural E-Moo-Nity was because they wanted to exclude them from the main analysis. That's the only reason they're there. Or it's the main reason they're there. And then the third of all would be, people are always saying, how are you going to prove it? How are you going to prove you have natural E-Moo-Nity? Well, all they did in these 2 trials is they just did a blood test at baseline for anti-nucleocapsid antibodies. Anti-nucleocapsid antibodies are the antibodies that you only get to natural infection and you don't get to the juice, because the juice is based narrowly on spike. At least the juice is available in the United States. And so all this is a blood test for anti-nucleocapsid antibodies. Real simple. But more to the point, in these trials, this is very different from all the other studies. In these trials, why did they get a blood test? Because they entered the trial, period, end of story. Okay. So all these people that tested positive, we don't even know if they ever got sick. We're not talking about the person who lost their sense of smell and taste, may or may not have gotten the nose test, may or may not have gotten the blood test. We're not talking about that. We're talking about They may never have even sneezed, but they showed that they had anti-nucleocapsid antibodies. So this is much broader than who we think we're talking about when we're talking about who are the people who actually got the illness, who are the people who actually go around saying, last year I got the C, right? It's way broader than that. It's you had no idea you were sick. You got a blood test. It showed you had anti-nucleocapsid antibodies. We know that you experienced it at some point, even though you never noticed it. Those are the people being compared in these trials. Okay. All right. So what did they find? Well, in the Aztec trial, where people were followed for an average of 3.4 months, the unjuiced never immune placebo group had a 1.7% risk of becoming a symptomatic case. That risk of becoming a symptomatic case was 0.8% in unjuiced people who had natural E-Moo-Nity, so it was less than half, and it was 0.5% in those who were who never had any kind of E-Moo-Nity but got juiced. All right, so it's one. So natural E-Moo-Nity is like in the middle. It's closer to the juice, but it's in between the juice and the just straight up placebo. In Mr. Fuzzy trial, where a slight majority of people were followed for 4 to 6 months, so a handful were followed more than 6 months. Most of the rest of that 40-something% of people were followed for less than 4 months. So in that one, it was the maximum risk was 4.7% chance of becoming a symptomatic case if you were placebo, no E-Moo-Nity of any sort. And then that 4.7% fell down to 1.3% if you had natural E-Moo-Nity, and then down to 0.5% if you had the juice. Now, if you had the juice and natural E-Moo-Nity, it fell down even slightly more than that, from 0.5% to 0.4%. Okay, now the other thing I forgot to mention is that you come in at baseline and you get the test. Not only are we including people who never even sneezed but had the blood test showing the antibodies, but we are also talking about people who we have no idea how old their infection was, because all we know is they came to baseline, they showed this blood test showing that they had it in the past. So this could be anywhere going back to like January 2020. But generally speaking, the natural infection was many months earlier than the juice in these trials. So we're talking about an old natural infection that you may not have ever had a clue you had versus the juice. And even in that comparison, and even in the juice manufacturers' trials, and even pre-variants, we're basically looking at this and saying, it looks like natural E-Moo-Nity of this sort is 53 to 72% effective at protecting against becoming a symptomatic case. And the juice, and that's when it's natural E-Moo-Nity that's 9 to 12 months old, is 53 to 72% effective at protecting against becoming a symptomatic case. And juice that is on average 3 to 4 months old, so much more recent, is 70 to 90% effective. That's in the juice trials. Okay. Everything from here on out looks better for natural E-Moo-Nity. And so the first thing we're exiting when we exit the juice trials is we're not under the control of the juice manufacturers anymore, right? So this is, now we're exiting the things that were funded and totally controlled by the juice manufacturers. And now we're also starting to get into more realistic testing things, because we're not talking about you came in for baseline, you got a blood test, we never knew you even sneezed, but you showed evidence at some random time in the unknown past you have evidence of an infection. We're now generally getting into, there were more specific reasons for why people were tested when they were tested. In some cases, it's because it was a hospital or a long-term care center and elderly people, and they were testing biweekly or once a month, or it's cases that are more sort of general population stuff where you were exposed or you got symptoms, so you got tested and things like that. Okay, so oh, and by the way, another reason that's important to make, an important point to make, is that in the juice trials, the only reason anyone got the test of the endpoint infection was because they experienced symptoms. So we're casting a very broad net for this natural infection you may never have sneezed over. But then at the endpoint, we're looking very specifically. So in all the rest of these studies, we're generally have a much better match between what was the evidence for the natural infection and what was the evidence for the endpoint infection that we care about. Okay, so let's first look at and by the way, leave your questions in the live chat and I will answer them all when I'm done with this. We're done with this section, so I take a sip of wine. Okay, so pre-Delta observational studies. Among staff in publicly funded hospitals within the UK, when the Alpha variant was dominant, the rollout of the Mr. Fuzzy vaccine was studied. Oops. Let's see if I get the warning. All right. Anyway, I'm trying. I'm really trying. Okay. So the rollout of the Mr. Fuzzy juice was studied for 2 months. Everyone got tested. Everyone got the nucleic acid test every 2 weeks, and previous infection status was taken from medical records based on the nucleic acid test or the antibody test. The age of the natural immunity was unknown or unreported, but the juices were only up to 2 months old. So we're comparing old natural infection to new juice. For every 100,000 person days, meaning you multiply the number of people by the number of days to normalize how long people were followed for. For every 100,000 person days, the chance of a positive test with no type of E-Moo-Nity was 20. With the Mr. Fuzzy juice, it was 5. And with natural E-Moo-Nity, it was 3. And if you formed a hybrid between natural E-Moo-Nity and Mr. Fuzzy, it was 2. So that suggests that a very recent Mr. Fuzzy vaccine is 75% effective, while an older case of natural E-Moo-Nity is 85% effective, so more effective. As soon as we leave the juice manufacturer trials, suddenly natural E-Moo-Nity all of a sudden looks better. All right, so 75% for the juice, 85% effective for natural E-Moo-Nity. So that's a little bit better for natural E-Moo-Nity. And combining that, the two adds a little bit of an extra boost, at least over a 2-month period. But what do we know about the Mr. Fuzzy juice is it starts wearing off after 2 or 3 months, right? So this is just going up to where the juice looks really good and natural E-Moo-Nity still looks better. Next study. In long-term care facilities in the UK during the Alpha variant. So there's again during the Alpha variant, but instead of in staff of publicly funded hospitals, we are now in a long-term care facility where everyone's over age 65 and the median age is 86. So we're talking about really old people. During the rollout of the Mr. Fuzzy and Aztec juices over the course of 3 months, people got tested every month and were also tested if they got sick or if there was an outbreak detected, they tested everyone. A positive nose test or an antibody test was used to define natural E-Moo-Nity. The age of the natural E-Moo-Nity was unknown or unreported, as with the previous studies that we've been looking at so far, but the juices were no more than 3 months old. So again, old natural E-Moo-Nity versus new juice. The juices reduced the risk of testing positive by 64%. Hey, not bad for the juice. But natural E-Moo-Nity reduced the risk by 88%. Not so bad for natural E-Moo-Nity. Adding a juice to natural E-Moo-Nity had no benefit. Not even a trend toward a benefit. In this population, older natural E-Moo-Nity was almost 40% more effective than recent juice. All right, so once we moved out of the juice manufacturer trials, already we are 2 for 2 of natural immunity being superior to the juice. But what's not consistent is the first study showed a slight benefit of adding the juice on top of the natural immunity, and the second one didn't. Number 3, now we're moving out of the UK, but we're staying in long-term care facilities, and we're not in an alpha-specific environment anymore. This study was not specific about the variant. So in long-term care facilities within Spain, where everyone was over 65, again, the mean age was 86, almost identical to the UK long-term care studies. The rollout of Mr. Fuzzy and the modern juice, which was almost entirely Mr. Fuzzy, 99.8% Mr. Fuzzy, 0.2% the modern juice. So basically, this is a Mr. Fuzzy study. Was studied for 2.5 months. So again, everyone who's juiced is juiced very, very recently. And we know Mr. Fuzzy looks great at 2 or 2.5 months and starts looking a lot worse at 3 and 4 months. We know that, right? So these are all designed to make Mr. Fuzzy look really good. Okay. Testing was done whenever anyone had symptoms, was considered at risk of exposure, or was new to the facility. So it's almost the same as before, but it's slightly different criteria for testing. In this study, they wanted to separate the effect of natural immunity from the indirect effect of widespread juicing. And so they pulled something really weird. I don't like what they did. I understand why they did it. I don't like it because I believe when you compare 2020 to 2021, in 2021, you're seeing cumulative immunity that is not just from more juicing. It's not just from more natural immunity, but it's also from just cumulative exposure to viral doses below the minimal infectious dose. It's due to kids wiping their hands on the playground and rubbing it in their eye with dead viral fragments and developing mucosal immunity, and somehow, silently passing on little bits to the adults. And, I think a lot of stuff is going on where you just get like 2021, people should be more immune than 2020 across the board for many different reasons. So I don't like the way they did this, but I understand why they did it. And yet still, let's look at the results for immunity. So natural immunity. So they compared 2 different time periods. The protective effect of natural immunity was mostly 2020 going into January of 2021 compared to the protective effect of juicing in 2021. The natural immunity was on average 6 months old, while the juice, and so now this is the first study where it's not unknown or unreported when the natural immunity occurred. Now we know here that the natural immunity was on average 6 months old, while the juices were not on average, but up to a maximum of 2.5 months old. So we know that, the average juicing must have been in between that. And so was, several times more recent relative to the infections that we're looking at. So again, old natural juice versus much more recent, old natural immunity versus much more recent juice. And so despite all that, per 100,000 person days, the risk with no immunity was 12.8. With juice, it was 5.4. And with natural immunity is 1.8. 1.8 sounds a lot better than 5.4, doesn't it? So combining juice and natural immunity did bring that down from 1.8 to 1.1. And while that does show a slight boost of the combination, the natural immunity alone was 3 times better than the juice alone, right? So it's like, once you're 3 times better, it should at least be your own choice whether you want to get the next little bit off the margins, right? Okay. So every study so far has been peer reviewed. Now we're into preprints. But that doesn't mean these are worse studies, because although peer review is important, now we don't even have any peer reviewed studies on Delta, right? So we're still not at Delta yet, but we're at our first preprint, but we need the preprints. Otherwise, we are going to be talking about last year's news. So we have to do the preprints. Okay, so our first preprint and our last in this current section, covering the 4-month rollout of Mr. Fuzzy and Aztec among the staff of a cancer center in Milan, Italy. They studied the protective effect of the juice over the rollout compared to the protective effect of natural immunity over a different previous 8-month period. So this study, like the last one, is comparing two different periods, which I believe biases this towards the juice, because the juice is in 2021 when there's cumulative immunity from many different reasons. That's better than 2020, I believe, compared to natural immunity from 2020. We are now outside of the long-term care facilities and we're back in the hospitals, specifically a cancer center. And we are still pre-Delta. And so far, every single study outside of the juice manufacturers has made natural immunity look better. Okay, so what do we have for this last one in this section? During both periods, the nose testing was done at the beginning and end of the period, upon beginning and end of the study period automatically. During the period, if someone developed symptoms or had a positive antibody test during routine antibody testing, after any holiday when people came back to work, and for the doctors, it was every 2 weeks, no matter what. Okay, so natural immunity was up to 8 months old, whereas the juices were on average 2 months old. So again, it's old natural immunity versus new juice. The infection rate among those with no immunity at all was 9.5%. Among those with the juice, it was 1.5%. Was natural immunity better or worse? It depends how they did the nose test. So if they did the nose test against against one single gene, which is less rigorous, and when you do the nose test, you never know what they're doing, right? They're just doing it. They don't tell you the threshold. They don't tell you which genes. Or I don't know if you can find out from the company, but you generally don't. You just find out if you're positive or negative usually. So if they looked only at one gene, which is less rigorous, then the reinfection rate was 3%. But if they did the more rigorous test of having to have more than one gene test positive in order to consider someone positive, it was less than 1%. So depending on, they just reported straight up 9.5%, 1.5% for no immunity and for juice. And they were very kind of, what's the word? They seemed unsure of themselves when they were reporting the reinfection rate. And so it was either 3% or it was less than 1%, depending on how rigorous the nose testing was. And so I don't want to say it was 3% or it was 1.5%, but given that no immunity was 9.5%, I think we can just average those two numbers out and just say it was roughly 1.5%, which was roughly comparable or roughly the same as as the juice, right? So out of 4 studies, now that we've moved away from the juice manufacturers, all 4 of them, so one of them says comparable, maybe better, maybe slightly worse. It's unclear. It's ambiguous. So we'll just call it comparable. And then 3 out of the other 3, so 3 out of the 4 say natural immunity is better than the juice, sometimes a lot better, 3 times better. And then sometimes among those 3, let's see, did we have 2 or 3 that looked at the combination? So in 2 of those, the combination looked slightly better, and in 1, it was not better. So it's conflicting about the hybrid immunity. All right. So our next section is one single study that covered the whole of Israel. This is by far and away the most gigantic study that in existence. This covered the entire population of Israel. It's a preprint. It covered from June 1st, 2020 to March 20th, 2021. It's almost a year long, not quite. The entire country, because the government takes the data from all the HMOs. So this is, say what you want about the benefits or harms of living in a surveillance state, but Israel has very centralized data collection. And so when we want the data, Israel has Excellent data. Okay. So in the entire country of Israel, not controlling for time, but when we know that natural E-Moo-Nity was 2 to 10 months old by the time that the last person got infected during the observation period, whereas the juice was 0 to 3 months old by the time the last person got infected in the observation period. So we're talking way older natural immunity compared to very recent juice. And in this case, unlike most of the cases, in this case, in only one other study did we have this knowledge so far. We know how old, very good data, we know how old the natural immunity is. We know it's old compared to the much more recent juice. We also know this was pre-Delta, but we also know it was Alpha. This is when the Alpha dominant was variant. I mean, the Alpha variant was dominant. We know this is all Mr. Fuzzy juice. And we know that the nose testing was free and it was generally ordered because someone was sick or they were exposed to someone who was sick. Okay, let's now compare very old natural immunity to much more recent juice. The much more recent juice was 93% effective against infection, 94% effective against hospitalization, 94% effective against severe illness, and 94% effective against death. Now, remember, we know Mr. Fuzzy stops looking so good after a 3-month period, but this is during a 3-month period, okay? That's why Mr. Fuzzy looks so good. The much older natural immunity, what does it look like? Well, compared to 93% effectiveness against infection, natural immunity was 95% effective against infection. Compared to 94% against hospitalization, natural immunity was 94% against hospitalization. Against severe illness. Sorry, 94% for the juice, 95%. 94% for both the juice and natural immunity against hospitalization. 96% against severe illness versus 94% for the juice. Now, here's the kicker. Unlike the 96, unlike the 90, what was it? The 94% effectiveness of the juice against death, they couldn't calculate the stats for natural immunity. Why? Because only one person in the entire country of Israel died from a second infection. And so you can't do stats on an N of 1. And so it's about as effective as you can get against death. Okay. Now we're on our last 2 studies. What's unique about these 2 studies? Number 1, they're the only 2 Delta studies. Number 2, these 2 studies are the only studies that looked at people who got juiced and infected at the same time. So every single study has compared old natural immunity to new juice. Now we compare same time juice and immunity. What does it look like? One of these studies was, they're both preprints. One of these studies was done in Israel. One was done in the United States. Why did they do it in the United States? Because the Israel study made natural immunity look so much better than the juice that they got scared in the US and they said, we got to copy their study. What's different about the US is that in Israel, they did it from the 2nd largest HMO. In the United States, they did it with data from the Veterans Administration hospital system. And because they did the veterans, the people tended to be older. So the average age in Israel was 33 or 36, depending on whether they were talking about their small sample with 14,000 people in each group or their large sample with 40,000 people in each group. It was 33 for the smaller 28,000 person sample, and it was 36 for the larger 80,000 person sample. In the US study, because it was veterans, the average age was 62. So double the average age in the United States. Other than that, these studies were very, very similar. So the US tried to copy and replicate. And this, hey, that's the scientific method, right? The final step is replication. The United States study in the veterans, other than them being twice as old, tried to basically copy the Israeli study and see if they could replicate the results. Now, in the Israeli study, and so I watched someone like myth bust this study and point out that there were the confounding factors that were risk factors were slightly higher in the people with the juice in this study, and also pointed out that there's survivorship bias because if you died, like if you were in the natural infection group instead of the juice group, that means that the people in your crew who were vulnerable to dying already died before, so they can't die again. Survivorship bias is like, okay, well, that can explain severity because the people vulnerable to severity died, but it can't explain the infection rate. And then the confounding factors, they did a multivariate model that adjusted for the minor, in most cases, minor differences in confounding factors. Some were, less than minor. But anyway, what I'm giving you now is the multivariate controlled for matching people according to when they got juiced versus when they got infected, and then also matching for demographics and comorbidities. So all the things that you would expect to contribute to risk. And then they also did further analysis that I'm not going to go into to show that in most cases, those confounding factors were not responsible for any differences in the raw data anyway. Okay, so in the Israeli study, natural E-Moo-Nity had 13-fold better, nuts, right? 13 times better protection. And there's the first study that ever compared head-to-head time-matched juice versus infection. So that's why the study was so hot when it came out, shared so much everywhere. 13-fold better protection against, it's not cherry picking, it's just, it was the first time-matched study ever. Okay, 13-fold better protection against infection, 27-fold better protection against developing symptoms, 8-fold better protection against hospitalization. No one in the study died. Now, that was in the 14,000 person per group sample, so 28,000 people to match for time. Then they said, if we don't have to match this for time, we can just open it up to 28,000 to 40,000 people in each group. And so when they did that, now remember, if I want to know what happens to me when I take this, I want to control for confounding factors. But if I'm the bouncer or I'm the mayor or I'm the dictator or I'm the governor, and I want to tell you whether you have a right to feed your family or not, I don't want confounding factors. I don't want to unconfound the confounding factors. I want the raw data of the randomness. Okay. So this next analysis is very relevant to that, because this is just saying, like, out of the whole pool, not trying to control for the time matching. Although they are still matching, they are still adjusting for confounding factors. So it's not quite the raw data, but I'll get to that. Not matching for time, they found that natural E-Moo-Nity was 6-fold better protection against infection and 6.7-fold better protection against hospitalization. Again, even in the bigger sample, no one died. Okay, now the US study tried to copy this, but the people are twice as old. What did it find? Well, at first glance, it appears to suggest that the juice works better than natural E-Moo-Nity for people over 65, but not for younger people. For seniors, the juice offered 66% lower risk of infection and hospitalization and 95% lower risk of death. However, and if you're on YouTube, I'm going to show you the figures on the screen in a second. And if you go to my article, the figures are reproduced there. The study covered June through August of 2021, and the delta didn't reach close to 100% of infections until July and August. By August, natural E-Moo-Nity, even in this study, had become equivalent to the modern juice and superior to the Mr. Fuzzy juice. Now, their figures aren't well explained, but if I understand what their figures are showing correctly, what they show, and if you're looking along on YouTube or you're following along on the article that I wrote, they show that with natural E-Moo-Nity being the green line, the modern juice being the red line, and the Mr. Fuzzy juice being the blue line, and with being higher up on the graph better than being lower on the graph, And with survival meaning not getting infected, so 100% survival means no one got infected. What they show is that even adjusting for all the confounding factors, which is what is this going to do to me biologically? Natural immunity by August became equivalent to the modern juice and became superior to the Mr. Fuzzy juice. So that seems to be showing its superiority as Delta takes over, which isn't surprising, right? Because Delta evades specific immunity to the spike that these juices are based on, whereas natural immunity has much more broader targets and therefore should be more resilient to a changing variant landscape. So then when they didn't control for all the confounding factors, which is relevant to the juice mandates, this is relevant to, can I filter who's clean and dirty on the street with a juice pass? When they weren't adjusting everything, natural immunity showed its superiority to both juices by mid-July, and by August it had the gap just widened, so that natural immunity was clearly better. All right, so that's all the studies. What can we say about hybrid immunity? And then I'll come back to the conclusion on this. So brief comment on hybrid immunity, then I'm going to answer questions in the live chat. So studies conflict on whether juice and natural immunity combined offer some superior advantage. Now, I'm just talking about the ones with infection risk. So in the Israeli Delta study, it suggested that the combination might cut the risk in half. But if you have natural immunity and you're asking the question, should I get juiced? Then the appropriate way to look at that is in people who had natural immunity first and then got juiced. So in other words, they didn't get juiced and then they had a breakthrough. They had natural immunity and then got juiced. Well, what did that combine to produce? And that does look like the risk was another 40% lower, again, on top of the 27-fold better risk you already had. You get another 40% reduction, but it's not statistically significant. As if 27 times better protection is not enough, right? Similarly, in the Mr. Fuzzy trial, adding the juice on top of the natural immunity looked like it provided a 60% further drop in risk, but that wasn't statistically significant either. And then there's a Centers for MMWR non-peer-reviewed study from Kentucky that does not make the cut for the 9 studies here because it didn't look at natural immunity with no juice versus juice with no natural immunity. It took everyone had natural immunity and it just looked at if you add a juice on top, what does it do? And it showed a 40% reduction in risk, which was statistically significant and does kind of line up with what the Mr. Fuzzy trial showed and with what the Israeli Delta trial showed, but couldn't reach statistical significance. So it kind of looks like that added benefit is there. However, and conversely, there's also a preprint from healthcare workers in India that showed that out of people who got, it's the inverse of the Centers for study. It was everyone had the juice, but what was the extra advantage of having already been natural immunity? And what they showed was just out of everyone juiced as healthcare workers, if they had gotten natural immunity before they got the juice, they had an additional 74% reduction in risk compared to just getting juice. So it works both ways, right? They say, oh, you have natural immunity, you should get the juice. But that Indian study is saying you got the juice, but man, if you had survived the natural immunity, man, you'd be so much better off. It's the same kind of thing. Okay. So nevertheless, there's at least one study contradicting the hybrid immunity concept. As I noted above, the long-term care facilities in the UK, there was no benefit to adding juice to the natural immunity. It's not just that it wasn't statistically significant. Supplementary table 5 shows that if you added the juice, time since juice, the risk goes wildly up and down out of nowhere. For people who are on YouTube, let me see if I can quickly pull this up. So let me let's see. I'm not sure if well, I think on YouTube you should be able to see this study, and if you can't, I'm just going to read it off for everyone anyway. So let's see, we're going to go to the supplementary materials and open this up. So we're going to go to evidence of prior natural immunity, and then you add the juice on top of it. What does it do to the relative risk? So the risk per 100,000 person days, I think this is, it starts out as 3 if you had natural immunity and you never got juiced. But if you got juiced in the first week, it goes down to 1.65. Then in the second week, it goes up to 7.3. Then in the 14 to 20 days after the juice, it goes up to 15 to 24. Then at 21 to 27 days, it comes down to 1.6. So now it's looking better. Somehow at the turn of 28 to 34 days, so like the second into the third month, no one got infected. And then in the next couple of weeks, it went up to 5.9. Remember, compared to no juice, it's just 3. So it's double the risk at that time period. Then at 49 plus days, it comes down to 2.7, which is basically equal to never having gotten the juice in the first place. So we're not talking about hybrid immunity not being statistically significant in this study in long-term care people in the UK who are all over 65 and mean age of 86. We're talking about adding the juice to the natural immunity just made that risk go up, swing. It was like a roller coaster. Actually, it wasn't like a roller coaster. It was like one of those pendulum things at the theme park where it's just like, it's up here and then it's way down there and then it's way up there and then it finally, when the ride is over, it kind of settles it right back where you were in the first place. And so, you know, we only have a few studies, but they're not exactly in total agreement with each other. And I think we need some more work on the hybrid immunity front. Anyway, certainly you should have the freedom to decide whether you want that roller coaster, right? Okay. So now, as I noted in the article, I also wonder whether there are other types of hybrid immunity that we should be thinking about. For example, there's a paper called, it's in Medical Hypotheses, is a you know the number juice developed by nature already at work. And this was published back in December 2020. And what they were saying was, it's possible that through the accumulation of dead viral fragments, we have something that is equivalent to like an inactivated juice, in the sense that we're not getting infected, but we are developing immunity. Warning to people on Instagram, if you asked a question, Instagram's going to cut me off in 1 minute and 50 seconds. I'm going to go right back on. So just go right back there. But if you asked a question here, I probably will not see it. So in 1 minute and 40 seconds, come back to the new live and then post your question there. Okay. So anyway, I wonder if dead viral fragments and just exposures beneath the minimal infectious dose aren't acting as boosters to lots of people with natural immunity. And so I wonder if one of the ways that we should maybe be thinking about hybrid immunity is if you were to know that you have a certain protection based on your developed immunity, should you be relaxing your guard, not to try to get sick, but just to maybe be less zealous about overwashing and over sanitizing everything to have more of these natural boosts. And of course, because we don't know exactly who is how immune, then there's obviously some danger in that line of thinking, but you know, there are side effects to juice and there's danger in that line of thinking as well. And so I do think this is well deserving of study, is what are all the different types of hybrid immunity that we could have? Because one thing I do wonder about is if you have broad natural immunity that should be more resilient to a changing variant landscape because it's not all focused on one specific version of the spike, then are you narrowing that immunity when you add the juice on top of it because that juice is so narrowly focused on the spike? And so are you maybe getting a boost that does increase your overall protection and yet narrow you down so that although your immune system is more activated and you are in net, you know, on average, you're at least in the majority of the studies we're measuring, but not all of them, you are getting a somewhat reduced risk. Are are you not also narrowing the type of immunity that you have, such that you wouldn't be better if we could better understand what the different types of natural boosters to natural immunity there are in order to safely harness them? Okay, so I'm not telling anyone to go out and get exposed, obviously. Obviously not. Okay, so I just lost Instagram, and so if you'll bear with me 1 second, I am going to just go back live on Instagram for those folks. And I'm just gonna title it Natural E-Moo-Nity Nitty Part 2. Capitalize part. All right, it's checking connection. I'm now live. All right, so anyway, so conclusions. So the only, and then I'm going to go to the live chat. So the only studies that make the juices look better than natural immunity are the juice trials and a surface reading of the US Delta study. If we read the US Delta study carefully, it makes natural immunity begin to show its superiority as Delta fully takes over. Every other study clearly shows that older natural immunity is equal to or superior to more recent juice. When natural infections and juicings occur at the same time in a fully Delta dominant environment, natural immunity appears to be superior. In the younger population of Israel compared to the older veterans of the United States, it seems to be wildly superior to the Mr. Fuzzy juice specifically. In by far the largest study covering the entirety of Israel, old natural immunity is every bit as good as recent juice against infection, symptomatic illness, and hospitalization. The only reason we can't say that about death is because only one single person died of a second infection in the entirety of Israel. To answer the questions that we posed at the beginning, does someone with natural immunity need to get juiced to obtain equal immunity to the juiced people around them? The answer, definitely not. Their immunity at worst is just as good as all the juiced people around them. Question number 2, will they get even better immunity if they add the juice? They might, but the studies are conflicting. Third question, and most important to me, which is the top part of this shirt, can I decide who to fire from their job, who to keep out of the gym, and who to keep out of the restaurant by considering people with natural immunity dangerous unless they've been juiced? Definitely not. If anything, this is the most obvious pseudoscience that you could have. The data show that simply having an antibody test, nucleocapsid antibodies, or a previous nose test is enough to show that even when your infection is way older than someone else's juice, it is equal to or better in its protection. Not allowing mere anti-nucleocapsid antibody test or any record of ever having a positive nose test to serve as equal proof of immunity to a juice card is scientifically completely unjustifiable. Okay, that's my spiel. You can get this article shared across all my social media. You can get it at chrismasterjohnphd.com/e-moo-nity. And that's that. If you like this, please subscribe, please like the video and share it. And then, of course, I did this because I put out a vote, and overwhelmingly the people that said that what they wanted me to write about was natural immunity. And so I spent 11 hours putting this together before I did the video. We're now at probably 13 hours. And so if you want to throw a tip my way, if you could go to chrismasterjohnphd.com/support or chrismasterjohnphd.com/donate and throw any kind of 1 penny, $1 billion, if Bill Gates happens to be listening or whatever, whatever you want to throw my way would be deeply appreciated. Of course, I'm doing this as a public service because tens of thousands of people are losing their jobs over this, and of course, many thousands of lawsuits will be waged, and for anyone that is waging particularly a natural E-Moo-Nity lawsuit, then I think having this on hand will be super valuable. Maybe I am not the authority by signing my name to an affidavit or anything like that, but certainly if you want to review what I put together with your scientific team, or just reach out to someone who has the right credentials to write an affidavit and say, hey, is there anything in this we want to add to it? I'm sure that what I've put together here would add to the ammo that you would need. And of course, I've moderated my tone on some of these things here. I didn't fail to acknowledge when studies look differently, because I'm not cherry picking anything here. When a study looked better in the direction of the juice, I put it there. And in fact, I probably could have gotten away with not putting not digging into the dozens of pages long supplementary tables of the Mr. Fuzzy trial to find the data that I put there, because probably no one would have noticed if I didn't put it there. And I put it there. So this is as complete a non-cherry picked set as I think we can have. And that's because I care about the truth more than anything, but also I care about freedom, and I don't want my freedom fighter crew making arguments that are not based in science. I want us to have the exact facts, and have arguments that are not, easily refuted, but instead are irrefutable. And I think that's what I put together here. So I'm going to go to the live chat and answer questions. If you asked a question in the last Instagram, you got to ask it again in this one because we crashed. And I'm going to go to I'm going to go to YouTube, and then I'm going to go to Facebook. Then I'll come back to Instagram. So Highlander says, so sup, Chris, getting drunk on the wine again? Unfortunately, I only had like 3 sips. And so now that I finished my spiel, I got to take 2 in a row. There we go. This is certainly more technical than Tim Ferriss's drunk dials. Anyway, Dr. Andrea says, back at you, my partner in science. I don't know if we're disclosing that. Anyway, we got some stuff coming down the pike that'll be a kick-ass collaboration coming. LEZ says freedom over fear. I love it. Well, props to Danny Presti of Max Public House, freedomoverfearusa.com. Bob C says the new 007 movie is about infecting humanity with nanobots to kill off the majority of the population. LOL. Oh, I forgot that was out. I've been wanting to see that for a long time. James Bond is, I feel conflicted because I feel like MI6 and the CIA are probably not our friends, but I love James Bond, that he's kind of a loner. He seems like an introvert to me, but he just outsmarts everything, and you wouldn't guess from his outfit that he knows martial arts, but he can kick your ass. And he's very adventurous, as coming from the guy who went to the island of Nisiros that most Greeks have never heard of, to try to find family that I had no reason to think existed. And I was off on a little boat. You could only get there by boat alone. And someone said, "Oh, you're brave coming here alone." I'm no James Bond, but I do like to emulate him. But anyway, a little torn between Bond and Snowden. I am reading Snowden's what is it called? Permanent Record right now. Very, very good. Snowden's an INTP like me, so is Bill Gates. But I figured when I realized that, I was like, Snowden's probably a better role model than Gates. But LEZ says she'll support. Great, I love it. Highlander says, I knew it. I don't even know what Highlander's talking about anymore. Highlander says wine time. Maybe he's talking about wine. His comments are so old. I'm behind. Fellow New Yorker here says visual connection. I got the C 1 year ago and haven't had one iota of a symptom since. But did you have the iota variant? That's the question. um, one iota of a symptom. Sorry, I'm Greek. One iota of a symptom sense. People are still afraid of me, and I'm predicting that they will continue to be afraid of me for years to come. Well, you know what we tell them: freedom over fear. Just love people. You know, people can fear you. You love them back, and that's what it's about. Um, the people fear you because. So one thing I learned from Joe Rose, Joe Speaks Truth on Instagram. When they make us fear each other, what they're doing is the government is acting as a narcissistic parent raising a global dysfunctional family with the unjuiced people as the scapegoats and the juiced people as the golden child. Look up just Google scapegoat golden child, read the article, and then see if you can unthink what you realize when you read that article with me having just said that. Okay. Chuck Becker says, looking back to the halcyon days of pre-C, it seems life was less complex then. Now I feel I have Cushing's disease and will come apart at the seams. If I spill wine on the carpet. Yeah, I mean, it's a higher stress environment. It might be the nature of a demic, but it's also the nature of the fear and scapegoating. Chuck Becker says, kindly tap the like. Please like, share, and subscribe, and please support. Chuck Becker says 28 different proteins in the C, and they just went for the spike. Yeah, I mean, there was a rationale for that, but one thing that where I'm working on the delta transmission angle is it does seem like the inactivated juice that is used in China is much better against the delta than any of the spike juices, and I think that's why. But before that was, even hinted at, they were thinking, well, the spike is more effective and that's why we want to do it. And I think they were rushed for time. But, I mean, I think we definitely have the hindsight to say that just going for spike kind of is the undoing of the effectiveness in the long term. Andre Bettinson says, seriously, I've heard there's different types of the spike as well, at least two, and juice only provide E-Moo against type 1. I'm not sure what you're talking about. I don't know if you're talking about the pre-fusion stabilized spike or if you're talking about mutations in the spike, but all those could be true, I guess. Chuck Becker says a bit overly focused, one track singularity. I don't know. Oh, the spike, I guess they're talking about. All right. Cheryl Nicole says this was truly educational and entertaining. Thank you, Chris. You're welcome. Jan 2852 says this is bigger than CV. C is just the trigger to enact the Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. World Economic Forum. They tried this for H1N1, but it fizzled out. And so, oh, that's so true. I think the reason people think I'm a conspiracy theory is because these people who are sleeping while they were awake were not paying any attention to what they were trying to do back during H1N1, back when Massachusetts passed a version of New York State. What is it? New York. New York Assembly Bill 146, which would allow suspected cases to be by the opinion of the governor or anyone the governor designates to be detained in any premises that the governor or anyone that the governor delegates says is suitable to detain you because they suspect that you're a case. Massachusetts passed something similar during H1N1. That's when Verichip was trying to get, they invented an implantable microchip that would tell you whether you were juiced or whether you were infected with the swine. And no one wanted it, and it didn't kill enough people to make anyone afraid of it. And so it fizzled out on its own. That's exactly what happened. What they're doing now is very tame compared to that. But you are an idiot who sleeps while they're awake if you think that what they explicitly tried to do during H1N1 isn't on their mind during this. I mean, give me a break. Anyone who thinks that anything that I've said is a conspiracy theory just was paying zero attention in 2009, is paying zero attention now. Anyway, Chuck Becker says, well done, Dr. Chris. Thank you, Chuck. Jan 2852 says, does anyone know if B cells will remember all 28 proteins after getting poked to remember just the one S? I mean, of course not. I guess Cheyenne is probably asking if you have natural immunity and you have memory B cells to the many proteins. I don't know if you get it to all 28 or whatever. I mean, it's probably biased towards what's on the surface, but it's certainly broader than the spike. Are they going to remember it? I think I don't think it's a binary will there or won't they, but I think you do have, when you have refining of the immunity to the next target, my understanding, not as an immunologist, but as someone who's, kind of studied immunology on the side, my understanding is that you will have B cell apoptosis that will kill off some of the B cells that are less relevant to the narrower target. And so I do think you will lose some of the memory. But anyway, Based L says, stupid broad question, but what are the risks of the juice? Not going to tackle that now because, I will do a deep dive like I did on this for that topic. And so I don't want to overspeak on that topic before I've done that deep dive. Martine Reed says, I've never heard of Klaus Schwab. Sounds German. If you've never heard of Klaus Schwab, then you have no idea what any of this is about. Let me say that. I mean, some of these people calling me a conspiracy theory probably have either they don't know who Klaus Schwab is or they read his book and they thought it was great. But anyway, Donna with a bunch of numbers after that says, just takes one protein to recognize it, but possibly could influence strength. But I think it's sufficient, just one. I don't know what you're saying, but the way that I read that is saying you only need one protein for the immunity. But the point is, if the virus is evading that specific immunity by mutating and by the selective pressure on it, then the natural broad response of the natural immunity will be more resilient to the changing variant landscape than the specific spike focused one protein. That's the point. It's not that of course, when it first came out, that was rational, but in response to the changing variant landscape, if the variant landscape is changing because of selective pressure induced by that one protein you're focusing on, then focusing on that one protein may be more effective at first, but then is the undoing of that efficacy in the long term. Jan 2852 says, which is better, natural first then juiced or juiced then natural? I hear that getting juiced first messes with B cells, high affinity to S protein. I have no idea. There's not enough data on that. There's very little data on that, but there is data both ways, right? I said the Indian study showed 74% drop in infection if you were juiced, but had natural immunity first. That seemed, I mean, you could argue that that's better than the 40 to 60% reduction in risk that the Mr. Fuzzy trial or the Kentucky study showed, significant or not significant. But I just think there's too many conflicting studies and nothing that I don't think you can reliably compare them. But I would think that natural first, juiced second, natural again after that would probably be the best thing, because then you could sandwich the narrow, just like quantitative stimulation in between the natural qualitative broadening of the targets. But I'm just speculating. AG says, Chris, thoughts on MR, the rest versus adeno, the rest for safety for men age 16-30. So I can't speak to that like I can speak to the natural immunity because I haven't done my deep dive, but my initial readings of the trials suggest to me that the Mr. Fuzzy and the modern juice are less bad than the Mr. Johnson juice on the clotting and are worse on the Bell's palsy. And I would generalize to that saying, if I was at specific risk of neurological and not clotting issues, then I would probably want to err on the side of, so not clotting, yes, neurological, I would probably want to err on the side of Mr. Johnson, or by generalization from that, the Aztec juice. And if I had the opposite problem and I was prone to clotting and not so much neurological issues, I would probably err on the side of the modern or Mr. Fuzzy juice. And of course, the durability issue is mostly with the Mr. Fuzzy juice. And so if I also didn't want to have to deal with endless boosters, I would go in that case for modern versus Mr. Fuzzy. Dana with a bunch of numbers says, I don't know, but I've seen case studies on many immune cells going down with juice. B cells were likely one of them. Your info fits with that observation. I'm going to have to look at the mechanistic stuff. I just, because I'm taking a break from transmission to do natural immunity, I had to sort of, I couldn't do all the mechanistic stuff in one day because just doing what I did here with just all the infection risk studies took me, we're into the 14th hour now. So, after I do the transmission research, I can come back to natural immunity in more detail on the mechanistic front. Bok Choi says, read his book, I think it was Schwab maybe, reminds me of Tragedy and Hope, written by a guy who with NWO plans were great. Just because there's so many questions that keep coming up and I want to get to Facebook and Instagram, I'm going to skip the great, redoing questions. Okay. Comments rather. Adam Nalameyer says, please speak about the various types of immunity tests and what data, where to go? And what data is measured. I see my local lab has 3 types. Well, what I just told you is that if we're going to measure it against infection risk, anti-nucleocapsid and antibodies or positive nose test are good enough to show the natural immunity. Period. End of story. Cheryl Nicole says, did any of the studies examine those who were juiced but later had a breakthrough? So yes, all of them were comparing that versus natural immunity and reinfection. That's what every single study I cited was. I wonder what the immunity data looks like for that scenario. That is the scenario, unless you're asking about natural immunity, then juice, then breakthrough. If that's what you're asking about, we don't have enough time to have studies of that nature. Based L says, do you consider the test safe? I consider it certainly safe to do every once in a while, with the ethylene oxide or whatever. I don't know about this every other day stuff. I question whether the residual carcinogens with the swabs are a problem when it's like every day or every week for a year. AG says, where do you get this research? I linked to it in my article, and it was a combination of PubMed, SSRN, bioRxiv, and medRxiv that I was searching. All right, I'm going to go to Facebook for questions on Instagram. Zachariah Salazar says, thanks for your fearless efforts. You're welcome. It's my pleasure and my duty. Avoraham Becker says, oh, I think he posted that on YouTube as well. Penelope says, natural immunity, PS, I'm Australian. I learned juice from the Australian when I was on We the People Are the News on Instagram with John Matlin and Danny Presti, I learned of him and Max Public House. I got this shirt from when I was on with John Matlin on We the People Are the News. I forgot her name, but she's Australian. We had to say the juice and all these code words. I invented the Mr. Fuzzy and modern and Aztec because I go into technical detail and all that stuff, but we had to say the juice and not the other thing because she was imminently fearful of immediate automatic canceling of her accounts if we didn't use the code word. And I messed up once or twice because I didn't have the cheat sheet in front of me, but she had actually given John the cheat sheet that was like, because I'm Australian, we need to have all these code words. But what I'm realizing now is that because I'm on Instagram and Instagram is imminently acting like it's going to deplatform me, I got to use the code words too. Okay, I'm going to go to Instagram for questions and comments now. Let's see. If we have any. So on Instagram, Quartal X says, what was the article's name again about scapegoat? Just Google scapegoat. golden child, and the top results in Google will be psychological theories about dysfunctional families. They're not about the juice, but read them. And so what Joe Rose, who's Joe Speaks Truth on Instagram, Joe Speaks Truth _ is her first account. Joe Speaks Truth 2 is her second account. I'm no longer able to mention the first account on Instagram. And it might say, are you sure you want to follow her? Because she spread all this misinformation, whatever. But they're probably going to say that about me soon, because research. Anyway, so she's the one who made this point that the juiced are the scapegoat. I mean, the golden child, and the unjuiced are the unjuiced are the scapegoat, and the juiced are the golden child. And if you read that psychological theory about dysfunctional families from narcissistic parents, I believe that you will be unable to unthink that analogy. Mr. Perfectly says, how's the wine? It's great. All right, I think that's about all for questions, but I'm just going to do one more round. Based L says, thank you for everything you're doing. Duke Man says, Mr. Fuzzy's a bad person. AG says, how would you know if you are at a higher risk for clotting or neurological? You just have to, if something has caused you to have twitching and tingling in your hands and feet, then you probably have a predisposition to neurological problems. Or if you have a funny feeling on your face, like your cheek, like there's some ants crawling around in your face, you probably have a predisposition to neurological problems. And if once upon a time you ran a marathon, you got deep vein thrombosis, you probably have clotting problems. But otherwise, you just have to do screening tests like you could for clotting. Women with high estrogen should assume that they're at predisposition to clotting because of the potential pro-clotting effects of estrogen. But other than that, if you've had high fibrinogen or something like that, you're at extra risk. You could proactively measure your D-dimer and fibrinogen first, but it's pretty hard to measure a predisposition to neurological effects. I just would say that, generally speaking, if you have a predisposition to serious neurological effects, you probably already have some. You just might not have been able to get diagnosed with anything. I've had plenty of neurological effects that were symptomatic, but the neurologist couldn't find anything. I can cure myself with my supplements, but the neurologist can't figure out anything with all the blood tests in the world and needle stimulation tests and MRIs with and without contrast. So I have a predisposition. I went psychotic when I was vegan. I developed major twitching when I went on terbinafine. Like I would never, ever think of doing anything that had any risk of neurological side effects. Because I've cured myself, or at least I've symptomologically cured myself with my own tinkering. But even neurologists, even well-rated neurologists can't figure out anything that's going on that has caused me to need to cure myself with tinkering. And so I'm not about to make it worse on purpose. Base L says there's known carcinogens in the nasal tests. Huh. Well, the ethylene oxide is used to sterilize them, but ethylene oxide is used to sterilize like all medical equipment. And so there's residual, but the residual is thought to be insignificant. It was true of basically every other medical equipment. It's just that which medical equipment are you sticking deep into your nose every day, right? And so you assume that it doesn't matter if it's every once in a while, like most medical equipment is, but when you suddenly change the medical equipment to being every day, then maybe it does start to matter. I don't know. All right, on Instagram, the Devil Duck says the Israeli study mentioned IgG antibody levels measured by this test below 50 units per mil are considered non-protective. What are your thoughts on that? And what level of antibodies does indeed confer immunity? I don't believe that there exists such correlates of infection in natural immunity. And I do not believe you can borrow them from the juice trials. And therefore, I just don't believe in doing that. And part of the reason I don't believe in doing that is because the existing data suggests that although there is some transfer of immunity between mucosa and systemic, there is still very specific mucosal adaptive responses that you would be biased towards getting that you can't measure in your blood. And therefore, if you're not going to measure those responses in the mucosa, I just don't think you're getting the whole picture with the blood antibodies. And so I think that if you know you've been infected and can prove it with a nose test, or you have evidence that you've been infected from an anti-nucleocapsid blood test that's positive, that's your evidence that your average infection risk is what is observed in those studies. And I think we need more research to do correlates of immunity. I don't think we have enough to deny that, basically. All right, I think that's all the questions. So please like, share, and subscribe. And again, I spent like 14 hours on this by now today, just because you guys voted for natural immunity over the platforms. And so this is in the context of taking the day off from what would have been the Delta and transmission work that's destined for peer review, that is meant solely as a public service, that's taken off from the book that I owe to everyone who pre-ordered. That is my passion that I really want to get out. So I'm multiple steps taking off from things that need to be done in order to do this as a public service. And so if you want to, in addition to like, sharing, subscribing, if you, in addition to that, want to kick me back something at chrismasterjohnphd.com/support, chrismasterjohnphd.com/donate, or just go to chrismasterjohnphd.com, go to the menu, click on purchase/support, and pick one of those things. It would mean the world to me. So thank you so much, guys. And I'm out. Have a great night and a great Sunday, everybody.